Buckwheat's alive. He's been in hiding because somebody had been stalking him. Alfalfa shows up. He finds him, and it turns out that Alfalfa was stalking him, and then he shoots him dead again. And the telling of it is nowhere near as funny as the sketch. There's nothing like a writer to screw up a pitch.
Hello and welcome to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. We're Gary Seath and Brad Robinson.
And you're not.
Brad, this week on My SNL Story, who do we got?
Very lucky, very talented writer from the Dick Ebersol era, and a very successful career after that, written for sitcoms such as Night Court, Different World, Boy Meets World. Screenwriter, author. He wrote for 2 seasons, season 9 and 10. As part of season 9, he's part of the writing staff that brought the first Emmy nomination to the show in 4 years to Saturday Night Live. Very excited and thankful. Kevin Kelton, welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join us, Kevin. This is very exciting for us.
No, you don't understand. I'm retired. This is not taking the time. This is filling my time.
Oh, good. Whatever we can do to help you fill your time, then. That's fine.
We're here to help.
We like to start every show, Kevin, with the same question. When did you first hear of Saturday Night Live?
I knew about it before it was on the air. When I was in college, my brother was and still is a stand-up comedian, and I would hang out with him at the New York comedy clubs, the Improv and Catch Your Rising Star and whatnot. And, you know, I would see other comics as well. I'd see, like, for instance, Alan Zweibel was a regular there, and Franken and Davis were regulars in the Improv and the Catch scene at that time. And I heard, you know, at the club that there was this new show that was being started called Saturday Night Live, and they were going to be hiring some of these guys, and that Alan Zweibel was going to be working on the show. And I was fascinated by it. So I was looking forward to the first show well before it ever came on the air.
Oh, wow. So it was an idea when you first knew about it.
Yeah.
Did that then make it a goal for you, something that you wanted to do?
You know, not really. I was helping my brother write his act, and I later got into stand-up myself and got into sketch comedy after SNL came on the air, and I did some college radio sketch comedy. But it wasn't, I don't think it was a goal at that point, although I was very aware of writers, and I don't know why. And I'll tell one quick story. When I was in college, Albany, where I went to school, was one of the cities that did not get SNL in those first couple of years because they thought it was too risque. So we had to go up to the tower of our dorm. Somebody would run like wiring from the antenna of the TV up there to the windowsill to get to pick it up. And so everybody would go up there. This is how the people that couldn't get dates spent their Saturday nights. And I was up there with the second season, and I remember watching the credits. And the second season, there was a new name in the credits, James Downey or Jim Downey. I forget which one he went by. And I remember focusing on that name and going, "Who's that guy? How did he get there? What is that? Who is this new guy?" So I was aware of writing credits even back then.
Nice.
So how did you then make that transition to, I guess, writing sketch comedy? We should say, too, Saturday Night Live was not your first sketch show writing for. You're one of the few people who wrote on Fridays and Saturday Night Live, and you were on Fridays before SNL. So kind of take us on that journey. How did you get into sketch writing and then onto Fridays?
When I graduated, I decided to try my hand at this comedy writing thing. It was just a hobby for me in college. And I moved out to LA, and I started hanging out at the stand-up clubs because that was my world. That's what I knew. And I was doing a little stand-up and selling some jokes. I sold some jokes to Joan Rivers and Tom Dreesen and a few other people. And I was writing spec scripts for TV, but I had a sketch packet. And I got a job on a game show, and then I got a manager. And while I was on this game show, he submitted some of my stuff to Fridays, and I went in and met with them, and they hired me.
It was that easy.
Just like that.
Well, that's how it went down. I don't know whether it was easy. I mean, believe me, there was a lot of time between me arriving in LA and me getting that job, but
yeah.
And that was the second season of Fridays, right? Or season 2?
That was the second 12 or 13 episodes.
Okay.
They had done 12 or 13, and then this was the back end of that season. Yeah.
Okay. And then walk us through then the end of second season of Fridays until you get on SNL in season 9. Because I know you were still writing. There was the Twilight Theater was in there, right?
Right. So I did those 12 or 13 episodes, didn't get picked up. They let a few of us go after that season because I got some stuff on. I got about 6 pieces on, which wasn't bad, but I didn't, knock them dead at Fridays.
Mm-hmm.
I did get some big pieces on, but not enough stuff. So then my manager would put me out for jobs. I had a job for 2 weeks on a show called Nashville Palace. I was there for 2 weeks until they decided this New York guy can't write. I forget the name, but if you remembered him, Roy Clark was the host of the show. And I did a show called Laugh Tracks that Howie Mandel was on, and Gail Mathias was a regular on there, and Lucy Webb. Then I did some other stuff. I did a Twilight Theater, which was a Steve Martin production. He did one of the sketches. And I met Neil Israel and Pat Proft there, and Carmen Finestra. And I did a show called No Soap Radio on ABC, which was 6 episodes, which was basically, it was a half-hour sitcom, but with Monty Python-like sketches in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we were on the sketch writing side of it. And I did a pilot for HBO called Matinee that never got aired. That was kind of a sketch comedy, like previews of movies to come, that kind of stuff. And then in 83, I was going up for all these different jobs. And one of them was SNL. My agent put me up for SNL. And they called me. She said, put together some sketches.
Another packet, yeah.
I had a lot of sketches already written. And, they're called trunk pieces.
Yeah.
And I went to my trunk and I found, 4 or 5 that I thought were really good and really right for SNL. And she sent them in and she called me back and said, they want to talk to you. So I get a call from Bob Tischler. And I think Dick was on the line as well, maybe Andrew Smith. And they're saying, they're talking to me. It's like a job interview over the phone. And then they said, well, we really liked your stuff, but we'd like to see a little bit more. Can you get us 2 more pieces within a week? And I knew what they were doing. They wanted to see if I could write live. They knew that these were probably trunk pieces, and they were right.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see if I could turn out stuff on demand, under deadline.
Sure.
And they wanted stuff written for their characters so they would know it was original. So I understood what the challenge was, and they gave me a week. I got it to them in 2 days. I got them 2 more sketches. I think I wrote a Weiner's sketch, and I wrote something for one of Eddie's characters, maybe a buckwheat. I don't remember.
Right.
And I got the job.
That's awesome. So this is right before season 9. So you show up, and now what kind of season 9, right? Eddie's big at this point, and he's a star on the show. What was the vibe like when you got there?
Well, first of all, when I got the job, again, I was a working writer.
Right.
So to me, it was just, I got a job on Saturday night. Saturday Night Live, as everybody knows, had gone through a kind of a rough patch. It was in the beginning of its renaissance. And I didn't think it was that big a deal until that night I went to the Improv, which was my haunt back then. That was my cheers. And I go in and I'm talking with friends and I say, oh, by the way, I got a new job. I'm going to be going to New York to work on SNL. And they're all going, what? You're going to be working on Saturday Night Live? I didn't think it was a big deal until my friends started reacting that way. So I think they hired me on a Thursday and they wanted me in New York on Monday.
Oh,
okay.
That's how quickly the turnaround.
Wow. So this was right away. Hey, we're about to start season 9. We need you here.
So I get to New York on a Monday, and you could look up the dates, but 2 days later on Wednesday was the infamous Eddie pre-tape.
That's your first
So my
day.
third night there was the Eddie pre-tape.
Right. Oh, my God.
I didn't have any stuff in it because I'd just gotten there. I didn't have any sketches.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting there watching. Now, again, I'd worked on Fridays. I'd seen Robin Williams in the Comedy Store. I'd worked with a lot of big people before then. But Eddie was the star of 9 sketches in a row.
Yeah.
And let me tell you something. You watch an SNL, even the host is in maybe 5 or 6 pieces and not necessarily the star of them. He was the lead in 9 straight sketches. And they did it in pretty much real time. That's tough. That's a lot of pressure. And he smacked it out of the park. And I'm sitting there in the audience and I'm thinking, oh, this is another level. I knew this guy was good, but he's working at a different level than I've ever been at.
I always wondered how they shot that night. Like if it was actually shot live to tape or there was a lot of editing involved, but it was pretty much live. Like they shot it.
Oh, no, they had a full audience. I think we had probably a dress rehearsal audience too. I don't remember.
Okay.
But it was done just like a show. Maybe not with quite maybe not done in 90 minutes.
Right.
Maybe it was done in 2 hours, but it was pretty close to a live show.
But they would shoot each sketch like just once, shot it live, and wow. They're so good.
That was it. Yeah. They might have done maybe they did a pickup here or there, but very little. Very little.
Wow.
So you said you didn't really find this to be a big deal. It was just kind of another job because you were already working, right? Were you watching the show at this point, or is it?
Yeah, I knew who Eddie was, and I knew the various casts. I probably didn't see every episode, but I saw a fair amount of them.
Right.
And I even know, I knew who Kroger and Brad were and Julia were. So, yeah, I was familiar with it. And I thought what everybody else thought. Eddie, amazing. Joe, pretty good. The rest of the cast, let's see what they can do. Yeah.
Right.
Well, once the season proper got started, it didn't take you very long to get some sketches to air. I don't think you had anything on the first episode, but second episode, you had 2 sketches in, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the first episode, I didn't score. The second episode was hosted by Danny DeVito and his wife, Rhea Perlman, very nice people. And I had 2 pieces in. One was a Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. I asked them what was the protocol on writing for the existing characters. Mm-hmm. And they, Dick or Bob, I forget who, told me, you can, submit it. And if it's good, it'll get in the show. So I wrote a Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. It was the one where Mr. Robinson finds a picnic basket outside his front door. And upon looking inside, he sees that it's a baby and it's his baby.
You're right.
That was the one with he looks inside and he makes one of those Robinson faces and he says, "Here's a riddle, boys and girls. What's black and Puerto Rican and has my eyes?" And there was a whole story that I could go into with them, with dealing with the censors about the word bastard, which was the day of the day, but the word of the day. But and I also had a sketch in where Rhea Perlman played a high school Spanish teacher that played pretty well.
That Rhea Perlman sketch, do you ever? I've watched it again. It reminds me of there's a sketch probably a decade later when Alec Baldwin hosts as a French teacher. And it's very similar where it's all like speaking the language and won't let people speak English in the class. And it's very similar in tone to that Rhea Perlman sketch.
Yeah. By the way, I feel like the show, and I don't mean this in the literal term of rip me off, but the show duplicated several of my ideas later on, like Mr. Subliminal, which Kevin Nealon did beautifully. I'm a big fan of Kevin Nealon's. But I wrote a subliminal advertising sketch and actually in show 4 of that season.
Right.
9.
Yeah.
So, writing for these established characters was not an issue, right? It was just kind of whatever. What other characters did you try to write for or did write for that, were already established on the show?
Oh, I wrote 2 Mr. Robinsons. I wrote one in season 10 as well, which was the Christmas one where he comes in dressed as Santa making Cabbage Patch dolls. I don't think Eddie really wanted to keep doing a lot of those characters. So, we were assigned to write a buckwheat piece, and I can tell you about that, if you want.
That's when he came back to host, right?
Yeah, that's when he came back. Yeah. And I know we're jumping ahead now to season 10, but if you want, I can go there now. So at that point in season 10, and again, we'll go back and forth, I guess, between these 2 years. Yeah. I was writing a lot with Kurtzman and Wald, great guys, great writing partners. And after the read-through of the Eddie, the Wednesday read-through for the Eddie show, Dick comes into our office and says, "Guys, we're in trouble. I don't have a show." And he says, we were going to do this piece that was read. It had Eddie at some point in a castle. I forget what the premise was. He said, "We already started building the sketch and I'm not going to use it. So I want you to give me buckwheat in a castle." And we said, but buckwheat's dead.
I was going to say buckwheat who's been shot. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Buckwheat had been assassinated the year before. We said, "But buckwheat's dead." He said, "I don't care. We need buckwheat." And he says, "Come to my office in 15 minutes. So we show up at Dick's office, and also in the office is Andy Breckman and Jim Downey. And he says, okay, you guys all know what I need. I'm leaving the room and you're not coming out until you have that sketch. I'll send in some pizza. And I think he actually literally locked the door from outside. I don't know how you do that, but I truly believe, my memory is that he locked us in the room and said, knock on the door when you're done.
Oh, man.
And we spent a few hours in there and we came up with this premise. I think it might have been my idea, but if I'm getting this wrong, I always hesitate to say that because I don't want to take credit for something that isn't mine. But I think it might have been my idea that Alfalfa is looking for buckwheat because he saw him in a newspaper or something and realizes he's alive. And then somebody else came up with the idea of, and what if it's Alfalfa who was trying to kill buckwheat? Mm-hmm. So that became a 2-part thing where we find out buckwheat's alive. He's been in hiding because somebody had been stalking him. Alfalfa shows up. He finds him, and it turns out that Alfalfa was stalking him, and then he shoots him dead again. And the telling of it is nowhere near as funny as
yeah.
There's nothing like a writer to screw up a pitch.
It's another season 10 story, but you also, along this line of existing characters you wrote for, but you wrote for Martin Short's character, right? Lawrence Auerbach. You did a couple of his, or at least one of those, right?
One of them, yeah. Good cop, bad cop. So he had created this character, Lawrence, in Synchronized Swimmers, which, of course, is one of the all-time great film pieces. And then he did it again in a sketch that Andy wrote where it was someone who had never climbed a flight of stairs before. And in an emergency had to climb upstairs for the first time. And again, I'm not pitching it that well, but it was a really funny sketch that Reckman wrote. And then Kurtzman, Wald, and I wrote a sketch where for the Roy Scheider show that we called Good Cop, Bad Cop. I think the actual title of the sketch was Two Cops. And it was Lawrence being the partner for Roy Scheider, and he didn't understand the concept of the good cop, bad cop thing. Whenever cops tend to you see that in movies. Who knows whether it's real or not? But, right. And so first he tries doing it as a sad cop. He misunderstood. He thought it was sad cop, not bad cop. And then he comes to Jim Belushi was the guy they were interrogating, and Scheider tries getting some information out of Belushi, and Belushi says, where was I last night? I was with your mother. I was third in line, that kind of stuff. And Scheider goes, he won't talk to me, Lawrence. He's all yours. And then Lawrence approaches as the bad cop, but he misunderstood bad cop. He had handcuffed himself, showing what a bad cop he was. Just silly Lawrence type of stuff that we were able to write.
So good. It's a lot of fun.
I think that's the only classic Martin Short character that we ever got to write for. Yeah. He was very protective of his characters, as were the other new guys. And that's a whole conversation that we can have about what that season was like. But I will say this, and I've said this on other podcasts. I've had the fortune to be around a lot of very famous, very funny celebrities. Steve Martin, Robin Williams, Jay Leno, Letterman, blah, blah, blah. The funniest person off camera that I've ever known is Martin Short. Just in a room with other people, hands down, the funniest person I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, one of the highlights of my life was a few years back, maybe 6 or 7 years back, somebody said, I just saw Martin Short mention you in an interview with Conan O'Brien. I said, what? Because I've lost touch with Martin pretty soon after we worked together. And he said, yeah, it's in one of those Jiminy Glick interviews with Conan O'Brien. Go look. So I go and I find the interview. And sure enough, about 4 or 5 minutes in, they're shooting the breeze about this, that, and the other. And they're talking about Lucy Webb, who's a very funny sketch actress. And Conan says, Lucy Webb, who of course is married to, and she was married to Kevin Pollak at the time. Uh-huh. So Conan says, Lucy Webb, who's married to, and Jiminy Glick goes, Kevin Kelton.
Not necessarily the news.
That's right, on cable. That was my first TV job.
I heard Lucy Webb could be discourteous.
No, Lucy Webb, very nice. And now married to, hello, you can fill this in.
Kevin Kelton.
Kevin Pollak.
Kevin Pollak.
That's right.
I totally cracked up because I guess he knew who I was, and I cracked up watching it. So I'm very honored to have been mentioned that way.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
That's hilarious. One of the people you just mentioned was Jim Belushi, who you worked with a lot, or I guess you collaborated with him a lot when he was on the show, right? Or wrote for him.
Well, we wrote sketches for him. Collaborate is, we wrote the sketches. Jim did them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fine guy. He and I had a what at the time seemed like a tumultuous relationship, a love-hate relationship. But we if we saw each other now, he'd put me in a big bear hug because that's how he was. But yeah, I heard you guys talking about the chess coach piece that I wrote for him.
That's one of my all-time favorites.
He was in the lie detector piece.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff because, he was good and he was fun to write for.
That chess coach, I mean, we have talked about it before, but it is one of my favorite sketches of all time.
I agree. I am one of my favorite, my own work experiences. I was in a parking lot in Coney Island with Jim Belushi doing that sketch. Give him the queen. Just give it to him. You call that castling? And I've been in touch with Jim trying to get him on the show, which he won't do. He keeps saying no, but we told him we were talking to you, and he did want me to say, let Kevin know, high school chess coach, probably the best sketch I did on that show in the 2 years I was there.
Oh gosh, what a nice compliment to get. Yeah, it was just one of those ideas that I had. I was on the chess team in high school, and I wrote a couple of pieces. In fact, I wrote another one called Chess Cheerleaders that didn't get on the air, but it was a precursor to what they ended up doing.
Yeah, that's another one they
did
20 years later.
Sherry. Yeah. But of course mine didn't get on the air, so I can't say that anybody would have remembered that. But I was obsessed with chess, and I wrote this chess piece, and it really played well. Jim was perfect for it. It was great.
Yeah, he was very good in that. We want to highlight some of the other sketches that are yours. Tell us about the First Draft Theater and what those sketches were about.
Well, those were me and Andy Kurtzman and Elliot Wald. So the three of us wrote them together. So basically going back is, my first season, I was hired as a solo writer. I was a solo writer. And I started off really strong. I had 2 pieces in the second show, 2 pieces in the fourth show, a piece in the fifth show, and then a piece in the sixth show. And then Christmas break hit. And then the back end of that season, I wasn't getting a whole lot in. I finally was able to get 1 or 2 pieces in toward the end, and it saved my job. But when I came back, I heard Gary, you guys interviewed Gary Kroger, and I heard that show, and he was talking about how you learn the politics of the 17th floor, and you learn how to be in other people's offices to get involved and get included in sketches. Well, as a writer, I learned that just sitting in my office by myself, I wasn't taking advantage of the collaboration that was available. So I broke out, and my first year there, season 9, Andy Kurtzman, Elliot Wald and Nate Herman had been hired as a team years earlier. Mm-hmm. And they were apparently a hot team for a while. Then they kind of partnered up with Andy and became a 3-man team. And the only reason that Dick allowed that to happen was because they were churning out a tremendous amount of material. So he wasn't losing material. He was getting as much as he would have from 3 individuals. In season 10, Nate decided he wanted to write by himself. He'd gotten a little burned out, and whatever he was going through personally, I'm not sure about, but he wanted just to try his hand at writing by himself. So Andy and Elliot were writing together, and I just kind of became part of their 3-man team. And we became a unit that season. So yeah, we wrote the First Draft Theater that I believe was in the first episode of that season. And then we wrote 2 more because Dick liked to, repeat franchises and characters. And the first one was really good. The second one was so-so. The third one had some technical issues that you guys probably remember. That was the third one where it was the writing of the Bible. And Chris Guest was doing the voice of God in the announcer's booth, and he lost his place in the script, and he had thrown too many pages over his shoulder. Apparently, announcers have a technique that when they're done with a script page, they throw it over their shoulder.
Oh.
I didn't know this until that night when we're sitting there. The live show is on. We're under the bleachers watching, and all of a sudden, Billy Crystal stops talking, and there's silence. God is supposed to come in, and God ain't there. And then we see Dick Ebersol run by going, he lost his script. He lost his script. And Dick had to, I guess, run into the announcer's booth and show him where they were in the script. It probably only took 8 to 11 seconds in real time.
Right.
But in writer time, it felt like 5 minutes of dead air.
An eternity. Yeah.
Oh, my God. You mentioned Andy Kurtzman. I wanted to ask you about him. I know you posted about him recently. I know you guys talk a little bit about how much you collaborated with him and enjoyed working with him. I know one of the sketches you mentioned recently was New Auctioneer, was you and Andy.
Yeah. So again, it was the three of us worked a lot together. You know, everybody always asks, well, if you're in a 2 or 3 person team, how does it work? With the three of us, it was very much like the Dick Van Dyke Show. Andy was usually Dick Van Dyke behind the typewriter. I was Sally Rogers standing there. And Elliot was laying on the couch and would occasionally sit up and throw out a brilliant line. and that's how the three of us worked.
Uh-huh.
But Andy and I felt really clicked as a team, more so than I ever clicked with anyone else that I partnered up with. And so the three of us wrote a lot of stuff together. There were a couple of pieces that, for whatever reason, Elliot wasn't around, and Andy and I wrote together. And one of them was on a Saturday afternoon. You know, our job was, Monday, Tuesday night, you write. Wednesday is the read through, and then you see what gets picked. Thursday, you maybe did some rewrites, and Friday, maybe you wrote some stuff for the news. And Saturday, our job was to be around, to go down to the stage during blocking before dress rehearsal. During the day, they did camera blocking in costume, in wardrobe. And you only went down to the stage for your stuff, so you had a lot of dead time. And so Andy and I decided we were going through our ideas and trying to come up with something to write for next week, and we didn't like anything on our list of ideas. And then Andy said, why don't we come up with a new idea and just start writing? And the rule is we can't stop typing. We have to keep going, no pauses until we have a full sketch. I said, okay, whatever, you're the one typing. So one of us came up with the idea of an auctioneer who's a sadist, and we just started typing, and we wrote it in real time. So if it was a 5-minute sketch, we probably wrote it in 10 minutes.
Wow.
And it went to air pretty much the way we wrote it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an amazing exercise, just as an exercise, but then to actually turn it into a sketch that gets to
then
air.
Pull it off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's
and I don't know that we knew that was going to work out that way. It just did. Yeah.
Right. Another sketch that I've always loved, and it's one of the ones, we talked about this with Gary a little bit, just, this era doesn't get the recognition a lot of people wanted to see. It kind of gets left behind. There's a sketch that I know you wrote that I love, I Am Also the World. And it came up recently again, because I think a few weeks ago is like the anniversary of the one time Bruce Springsteen and Prince in real life actually shared a stage. So it reminded me of this, but I love that sketch of Prince doing I Am Also the World with Mr. T and Hulk Hogan in the cold open. It's just such a great sketch.
Yeah. So again, occasionally, like I would have an idea that I'd pitch to the guys and it didn't click for them for whatever. So sometimes I went off and I wrote these things on my own. Mm. So this was one of my ideas. We Are the World was as massive a story as could have been. It was like the Super Bowl show this year that everybody was talking about, the halftime show with Kendrick Lamar. But We Are the World was just all over the news. And I had read that the reason that Prince wasn't there was this story that he had come up with, that he had to bail out his bodyguards after they had gotten into a fight at some club. So I thought, well, he's got such a big ego, he'd probably want his own MTV video. And he'd probably think, hey, I'm also the world. And so I wrote this this video, which, again, they used it as a cold opening. It played great.
Yeah.
Billy Crystal played Prince. Mm-hmm. Did use a little blackface. I know there's a lot of controversy over the fact that back then we did do things in blackface. But he did a great Prince. I figured we have Mr. T and Hulk Hogan. I might as well use them as the bodyguards. And the interesting story behind that sketch was Jim wanted to play Springsteen because Springsteen had a very big presence in We Are the World.
Yeah.
And again, when I say, Jim and I had a little bit of a love-hate relationship, Gary Kroeger did Springsteen, and Gary Kroeger did a great Springsteen.
It's really good.
Yeah.
And of course, as the writer, I wanted the best performance in the sketch.
Right.
So Bob Tischler calls me into his office. He says, you wrote this, said put Gary in it, but Jim wants to play Bruce Springsteen. He says, I think Gary does it better. What do you think? I said, Bob, there's no doubt Gary does it better. He says, yes. He says, so this is what I want you to do. Come up with another part for Jim. Give him another role. So I said, oh, okay. So there's also a moment in We Are the World where Paul Simon comes into on mic with Willie Nelson. And I put Jim in as Willie Nelson. And I think he agreed to step away from Springsteen and take that because he'd be on screen with Martin Short. And Jim very much wanted to be on screen with the guys because he still felt a little bit, second citizen on season 10. Right. And so he did that with Marty Short, and then the whole thing worked, and it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Nice to know people still remember that stuff.
It's I just happened to catch it because I saw the posting about it, the real life anniversary of the two of them, and it made me think of it. It's such a great sketch.
Yeah, thank you.
So with all of the changes then between seasons 9 and 10 and this all-star cast comes in, how difficult was it as a writer to make adjustments to writing for these guys? Because you said like Martin Short was kind of protective of his character, so you weren't writing a lot for him. What was that like?
For the most part, with one or two exceptions, and I won't name names, everybody was really nice. But they kind of made it clear that they had a little disdain for the existing writing staff. I'm talking about not so much Marty and Billy, but I think
Shearer.
Chris and Harry were just, a little protective of their comedy and their online presence. Right. Excuse me, their on-camera presence.
Right. Sure.
So they made it very difficult to write for them. If an actor didn't like a sketch that was going to the table on Wednesday, they could give it such a performance that it wouldn't get laughs and therefore wouldn't get in the show. We called it icing a piece.
Right.
So the writing staff realized very quickly that we had to write for everybody else because these guys weren't always going to be available to us. And certainly their characters, they didn't want us to touch. So it wasn't awkward. It was just a different dynamic where, we wrote. I mean, for instance, First Draft Theater, Chris Guest played Raymond Chandler in First Draft Theater. And Billy did a lot of stuff. Billy was wonderful to work with. Billy, I used to consider him the Willie Mays of comedy. He could do it all.
Wow.
And he dove for every laugh, You always knew that if there was a laugh there, he was going to find it. Marty was wonderful to work with. Again, we wrote some sketches that weren't his characters. We wrote one about the Salem witch trials when Harry Anderson was hosting. Dick wanted a sketch where Harry was playing a judge because he had just started on Night Court.
Right.
And Dick thought, well, we should have him playing a judge. So we made Harry the judge at the Salem witch trials. And we came up with an idea where Marty was the public defender of someone who was accused of being a witch. And Jim Belushi was a prosecutor. And Marty was great in that sketch. There were a few others, but they were all mostly nice enough people. Yeah. But, we wrote more for the other cast. Right. And I always liked Gary. I, always liked Robin and Mary, and Pamela Stevenson, could do a lot of fun things. Rich Hall was there. So it wasn't a problem. Jim, we wrote a lot for Jim. Yeah.
I was going to say, season 10, you got to reunite with a couple of your old Friday buddies. You just mentioned Rich Hall and Larry David were both back. How was that, seeing those guys again?
Yeah. Well, as you guys found out, because we traded a couple of emails prior to this, I've known Larry David since I was a college kid. When my brother started doing stand-up, they were very, very good friends. And Larry was a family friend and was over the house many times. And I played golf with him a lot of times. So it was just like being in the office with my big brother. You know how your brother's friends were sort of like your big brothers when you were growing up?
Sure.
So Larry was sort of like my big brother. I worked with him on Fridays. It was a total coincidence. He had nothing to do with me getting the job. Mm-hmm. And then he came to SNL and had that famous season that has gotten so much publicity, where he only got one piece on the air. He struggled with Dick and with the show. Dick just didn't get his stuff. The writers loved his stuff.
Right.
And every week we would go, I can't believe Dick didn't use that piece. Dick didn't put that in the air. His stuff would do well at the table, and Dick wouldn't slot it. And, the famous story of him quitting and then coming back on Monday, I was there for that.
I was going to say, were you there for that?
Absolutely true.
Oh,
absolutely. I mean, we would always go into Dick's office to meet the host.
Yeah.
I forget who the host was that week. And I'm sitting next to Kurtzman, and all of a sudden Larry's there. And we're all like, what's Larry doing here? Didn't he quit on Saturday? We didn't know what was going on. No one ever said anything about it. Now, for all I know, he and Dick might have had a conversation ahead of time and patched things up. But it just happened, and it felt like he quit and then he just walked back into work.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So one of the things about being on the show during this time period was you worked with Dick Ebersol, obviously, and I think he's someone who we talked about, the show at this time period maybe not getting its due necessarily. What was it like working with Dick Ebersol and his impact on the show?
You didn't work with Dick. You worked for Dick.
Yeah.
Okay. Dick was
fair,
in every sense of the word, the boss.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an interesting man. As I heard Gary Kroger reference in your interview with him, Dick was famously not a funny person. He was a very serious, very intense man. And I think he knew that. In fact, Jim Belushi used to joke around that he got an MBA in comedy because he had no credentials to be running the show other than the fact that he had helped Lorne put together the first 5 years.
Right.
And of course, I wasn't there for that. I don't know exactly what his contribution was in those years. But he did not have a comedy mind, but he had a producing mind. He was a very taciturn boss. He would walk around the office with a baseball bat.
Oh.
And believe me, he wasn't a softball player. It was a real, and he was already a 6'3", 6'4" guy. He didn't need that to be a presence, but he walked around with that baseball bat and it said something, and he could be very nice. I've told this story on one or two other podcasts. I'm sorry, I'm regurgitating old stories. But when I wrote that first Mr. Robinson piece, it's my second week on the show. I'm 27 years old. Yes, I'd worked on Fridays and a few other shows, but I'm new to Saturday Night Live.
Right.
And I had written as the word of the day, bastard.
Right.
Which, as you guys will recall, the word of the day was always on the easel.
Right.
And Mr. Robinson would come up and say, it's the word of the day, boys and girls. Bastard, can you say the word of the day? And while we were rehearsing on Thursday, Dick comes over and says, Bill Clotworthy, the standards and practices guy, says we can't do bastard. So I want you to come up with some alternatives and pitch them to Eddie. So I go, okay. So I go back to my office. I come up with like 6 or 8 or 10 alternatives. And, it's never as good as the line that you came up with first,
right.
But you do that. And I take Eddie aside and I tell him the problem. And I show him the sheet of paper and he's reading them. And he hands it back to me. He goes, nope, I want bastard. So I go to Dick and I say, I showed Eddie like 8 or 10 alternatives, but he still wants bastard. And Dick says, well, you created this problem. You fix it. And he walks away. And again, let me tell you, when Dick Ebersol says it, it's much more intense than it coming out of my mouth.
I'm sure. Especially to a 27-year-old kid, like you said. Like,
Yeah.
Second show,
Who does not have a baseball bat in his hand.
Exactly. So I put on my producer hat and I think, well, maybe if he doesn't say it out loud. So I go to Clotworthy and I said, Bill, what if Eddie doesn't say the word of the day out loud? He just points to it on the easel. And Bill Clotworthy said, but Mr. Robinson always says the word of the day. I said, what if this week he doesn't?
Right. Yeah.
And Clotworthy looked at me and said, this isn't a trick, right? You're not going to have him say it live, right? I said, no. He says, as long as you promise me, you give me your word of honor that he won't say it on the air live. Yeah, I can do that. Now, he may have actually, between those two conversations, he may have actually gone and checked with the people at NBC Standards and Practices, I don't remember, but he said, yeah, as long as he doesn't say it on the air, that's okay. So I came up with a cover line instead of him saying the word bastard. And again, it's Eddie Murphy. He made it work great.
Oh, it works so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the line was, he points to bastard on the easel and he says, can you use this word in a sentence, boys and girls? Cab drivers can.
Yeah.
It's a great line.
But Dick, so Dick, let us produce our own sketches, which of course Lorne also is famous for letting the writers sort of mini produce their own sketches. And that there was a lot of learning that came from that. But Dick could be tough. In the second season, once I started working with the other guys, I was getting a lot more stuff on the air. And a lot of it, a fair amount of it were my ideas or sketches that I had a lot of contribution to. So after a few weeks, I was the lowest paid writer on staff because they had picked me up by the skin of my teeth between seasons 9 and 10.
Okay.
In fact, you're on SNL back then, and this is probably still true, your pickup date was June 1st for the next season.
Okay. And
I get a call on June 1st from Bob Tischler and Andrew Smith saying, Kevin, listen, the show is going through changes. We're bringing on Marty Short and Billy Crystal and Chris Guest. But we're also making some cuts, and we got a lot of blood on our hands today, Kevin. We got a lot of blood on our hands. So as far as the writers, they said, if you want an answer today, the answer is going to be no. But if you could give us another few weeks, we'd like to see if maybe we could find some money in the budget to keep you on. And just like I said to you guys before, I said, hey, I'm not going anyplace. Right. Going. I said, sure, take whatever time you want, So 3 or 4 weeks later, they called me up and said they found the money and they were bringing me back. And then I got a call from Dick saying, I really respect the way you handled this, that you didn't put pressure on us and everything and you let us work it out. But so cut ahead to about 6-7 episodes in, and I'm really kicking ass there. And I asked my agent to see if he could get me a bump in salary because they had picked me up with a tiny bump in salary. And I was getting a lot more on than a lot of guys that were making more. And, I'm not going to name names, but when you work someplace, you know who's making what and who's scoring.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And my agent calls me back. He says, I got good news and bad news. The good news is they love you. They think you're great. They're really happy with what you're doing. The bad news is they don't have any more money for you.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, this is NBC. They got the money someplace for Kevin Kelton.
Right.
So I make it an appointment to go to Dick's office. And I say, my agent told me what you said, but I really think I deserve a bump. And he's telling me how tough the budget is and everything. And I said, come on, Dick, it's $1 million budget. You could find a couple of $100 for me. And he started yelling at me. Nobody knows this budget better than me. You don't tell me what the budget is on this show. I tell you what the budget is on this show.
Oh, my God.
And again, Dick Ebersol was a big presence even when he was not yelling. So I must have been shaking.
I can imagine.
And I leave that meeting thinking, I screwed it up. I'm not getting anything. So cut to, that was the week that Ringo Starr was hosting the show.
Okay.
And again, after the read through, Dick felt he didn't have a show. And he called a meeting of the writers and he was looking for other ideas that could highlight Ringo because he felt people are tuning in to see Ringo. We're going to get a big tune in this week. we cannot have a half-ass show. And Dick, this is 1984 or 85. And back then, TV movies were very big, and there'd been a couple of airplane disaster-like movies as TV movies, where they would cast them with all different celebrities. Dean Martin was the pilot, and Sonny Bono was in the back, and someone, and all these actors and actresses that were second, B+ level stars. So Dick wanted to do a parody of that, and he thought Ringo looked like Sonny Bono. He could play Sonny Bono. He thought that was funny. And he went around the room pitching this idea to the writers, and all of the writers thought it was formulaic until he got to me. I said, no, I think it's a perfectly fine idea. I'll work on that if someone will work on it with me. And so, Kurtzman said, okay, well, if Kevin's going to do it, I'll do it. So me, Elliot, and Andrew decided to take that piece and run with it. And after the meeting, Dick took me aside. He said, Kevin, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to find you your money. And the next week I got my salary bump.
Wow.
Nice.
You just had to get yelled at.
Yeah.
I did. And that sketch didn't get in the air. It got cut after dress. So, so we all won.
Should say you have been vocal. Again, I saw you write recently, like giving Dick the credit he deserves for saving the show, not once, but twice.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I can't speak to his input into the first 5 years. I wouldn't doubt that he had a big presence there as well. But certainly when he was tapped to take over when Gene departed, he kept it alive. And as other people have said, he knew how to highlight Eddie and Joe, and then did those 3 seasons in the middle there, and then brought on Marty and Chris and Billy and Harry and Pamela and Rich. And, we wouldn't be here talking about the show. I've said this on Facebook in a few different conversations. People put down those years 7 through 10. If it wasn't for them, there's no year 15 anniversary. There's no 25th anniversary. There's no 50th anniversary. Yeah. NBC might have canceled the show. Although I never thought they were going to cancel it. In fact, I think you guys might have spoken to the Doug Hill and Jeff.
Doug and Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah. And they were researching that book in season 10.
Yeah.
And they were writing it from the perspective of it's over, that it's a 10-year run and that's it. Mm-hmm. And they would talk to the writers, they were just around, and I guess they were doing their interviews, but to us it was just conversations. Uh-huh. And they kept saying like, oh, it's over after this year. It's over. And I said, guys, no, you don't get it. This is like the Today Show. NBC, as I'm sure you know, but maybe some of your listeners don't know. The reason Saturday Night lives is that NBC had to replace the Johnny Carson reruns, and that was a way to keep the Saturday night 11:30 time slot from going to the affiliates, who would have gladly run their own reruns there, which they could make a lot of money off of. And NBC was not giving that time slot back to the affiliates. There's too much money in it. And I said to them, guys, this show is going to be like the Today Show. It's going to run forever. And it turns out I was right.
Yeah, here we are, 40 years later. Yeah.
And it, you and I will be talking in year 7, in the 70th anniversary. I mean, if I'm lucky enough, but I don't think it's going anyplace.
Tell me this, or is this true? So you were approached by Al Franken to come back for season 11 after the changes were announced and everything?
Yes. So we all knew when Lorne was coming back. In fact, I got a call from, I refreshed my memory today by looking through, I have day planners for like 20 years of my life.
Oh, wow.
So I have notes, and I decided to go back and do some research. And I got a call in May of 85 from Audrey Pert-Dickman telling me that NBC had picked up the show, but Dick wasn't coming back. It looked like Lorne was coming back. And so, your job may not be here next year. I don't remember exactly what it is. She's a very nice woman, but they were nice enough to call us and kind of fill us in on where things were. So I knew I wasn't coming back because I knew Lorne wasn't bringing anybody back. We knew what the relationship was between Lorne and those middle years. At that time, they weren't middle years, but they are now. Yeah. And so I had moved back to LA. I gave up my sublet in New York. I took back my apartment that I had been subletting in LA, and I was moving on with my life. And I started watching the show because I was always a fan and I was always going to be a fan. And I was watching season 11 and, seeing that it was a train wreck.
Okay. Yeah.
And after their third, they started late that year. They started in November.
Mm-hmm.
And they did 3 episodes before Thanksgiving. And I think Pee Wee Herman was the 3rd episode. Mm-hmm. And the next week was Thanksgiving week. And like a day or two after Thanksgiving, I get a call out of the blue from Al Franken, who I kind of seen around the clubs, but I never really knew him. I never really had a conversation with him before. But he calls me up. He says, hey, Kevin, this is Al Franken. I'm working back on SNL now. Have you been watching the shows? I said, yeah, Al, I've been watching them. He says, well, then you probably know that we're kind of limping along a little bit. I said, yeah, Al, I can see what's going on. He says, well, I asked Jim Downey if there was anyone from last year that we should consider bringing back.
Oh, wow.
And he only mentioned 2 names, you and Andrew Kurtzman. Mm-hmm. So now that's not true. I happen to, I don't know this, but I'm pretty sure he also mentioned Andrew Breckman. But, but in the conversation, Al said he only mentioned you and Andrew Kurtzman. And are you interested in coming and meeting Lorne? I said, sure, I'd be happy to. He says, great. When are you going to be in New York again? Now, I was in Los Angeles. I had no plans to go. I was not a bi-coastal guy. Right. I said, Al, I have no plans to go back to New York, but if you guys want to fly me out, I'd be happy to meet with Lorne. He said, fly you out? No. I mean, the next time you're in New York, we'd like to bring you in and have you meet with him. I said, Al, I have no plans to be back in New York in the foreseeable future. But, I know how it works. I worked on the show. You guys get airline tickets from American Airlines for free. You can fly me out. He said, let me look into it. So I got off the phone. I think I immediately called Kurtzman and said, have you heard from the SNL people? And we chatted about it. And then a day or 2 later, Franken gets back to me and he says, we can't fly you out, but if you can be in New York, we'd love to walk you in to meet Lorne. Now, I'm one of those people, and this is a weakness of mine. I'm one of those by-the-book people where, like, I believe the WGA minimum basic agreement should be followed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I don't like being screwed out of stuff that should be mine. So I just said, I can't see myself. I'm not going to drop $500 for a round trip to be walked into Lorne's office and then said, well, thanks for coming by.
Right.
It's been nice to meet you. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, I should have done it. I probably would have gotten the job. I read like a couple of years later when the other big SNL book came out. I saw a couple of anecdotes about people who said, oh, they got called in for a meeting in Lorne's office and it was a perfunctory meeting. He hired me, on the spot or something. So yeah. I should have done it because one of my regrets is that I never got to work for Lorne. And everybody knows I worked on SNL, but it will always be the asterisk of the Ebersol years. And it would have been nice to be able to say, yes, I also worked on one of the Lorne seasons. Yeah. I don't know what it would have been like there in the middle of that disastrous season 11.
Especially that season, yeah.
And who knows whether I would have clicked or whether I would have been brought back for season 12. Who knows? But what happened was so I was in these conversations and I spoke to Kurtzman a couple of times. It was kind of like an open-ended offer. And then mid-December, I got offered a job on another sketch show in LA, and I just took that.
Right. Wanted to ask, and you kind of mentioned it with the Ringo Starr sketch. Any sketches that you wrote for the show that never made it to air that you always thought you always wanted to that stick out?
A lot that never made it. One that got cut between dress and air was I wrote a sketch in season 9 for Tim Kazurinsky called The New Century. And it was basically a cavalry sentry like 1880s. And it's nighttime and his platoon or whatever you call it, his troop, they were all asleep in their in their sleeping bags. And he was the sentry, but he wore thick glasses and was blind as a bat. And the whole sketch was, it had only 2 lines in the entire sketch. The one line was him going, 4 o'clock and all is well. And then he says that, and then an Indian sneaks into camp. And he's like crouching and looking around. And then the second one, comes into camp. And this sentry is so blind he can't see them. And pretty soon there's like 15 Indians just walking around and they're kicking things. And this guy just has no idea they're there. They're doing this in front of him, And the sketch ends with them killing all the other troops in their sleeping bags, taking off with all the valuables. They finally leave. And the sentry goes, 5 o'clock and all is well. Oh, but in between, he would hear a sound and he'd go, who goes there? Who goes there? So those were the only two lines in the sketch, the 4 o'clock and all is well, and who goes there?
All right.
And the cast really liked the sketch on paper. So much so that Brad and Tim and Jim decided, well, if we read this at the table, it's going to die because there's no dialogue. It's all going to be Dave Wilson reading stage directions. So they said, so why don't we put it on its feet? Which was really at that time unheard of
for the read-through
in the Wednesday read-through, to put a sketch on its feet. I've heard of it happening a couple of times since then.
Okay.
But so they actually did it with the script in hand, and they acted it out, and it did great, and it got into the show.
Uh-huh.
And what happened was it did great, and then we went into the room at 5 o'clock, and it wasn't in the show.
Okay.
And everybody was really frustrated by that. Dick had, for whatever reason, he'd put it on the side of sketches that were they're not in, but we're saving them. And you knew that was no man's land. You know that was the Bermuda Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't think much of it, but everybody was coming up to me afterwards and saying, you got screwed. That should have been in. That was a really nice piece. And remember, I was trying to save my job at that time. I was not getting a whole lot in the middle of the winter of 84.
Yeah. The second half of season 9, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So then a couple of weeks later, for the Don Rickles show,
oh man,
Dick had to be out of the office for a few days. He had to have surgery for some minor but important surgery that he had to have. I forget what it was. And Bob Tischler was running the show with Andrew Smith, and they put the Sentry in that show. And Dick came in on Friday and saw the lineup and went nuts again. He said, "What the F is the Sentry doing in the show?" But it had already been slotted, and they were already rehearsing it. So it was scheduled to be in the show. It was in the dress show. Yeah. And it was actually scheduled to be in the air show. It didn't get cut between dress and air, but because of the all of the Rickles ad-libbing, they ran really long, and that sketch got cut. And I was kind of relieved because I knew Dick hated the piece, and I didn't want it to go on the air at 5 to 1 and die. So
right. I
didn't care that much. But yeah, that one got cut.
So that's when it's like 12:30 in the morning, and they're like, "Not doing it. Got to pull it for time."
Sometimes you get that wording not at 12:30, you get it at 10 minutes to 1. You find out that your sketch is going to be in the show. And some people have asked me, somebody once said to me, I see that the actors were still in the Indian costumes, probably as a show of solidarity to you. I said, no, they didn't have time to change. They just found out,
right, 5
or 7 minutes to 1 that they weren't going to be on.
Yeah.
Another sketch, I didn't have a lot that got cut between dress and air. There were a few that I wrote that I really think would have worked well. I wrote a sketch. Remember you used to go to weddings, and in the ceremony, the band would be on stage, and they'd always do, the bride cuts the cake, the bride cuts the cake, hi-yo, the merry-o. And then the groom would cut the cake, and they do the same thing. So I thought, what if we take that to the extreme? So I wrote a sketch where the wedding band never stopped. Whatever the bride and groom were doing, they wouldn't stop singing it until they're back in their hotel room, ready to consummate their marriage. And, the bride, pretends she's a virgin. The bride pretends she's a virgin, all that stuff. And I wrote it, and in the sketch, I broke the fourth wall where I walk in and go, guys, what are you doing to my sketch? And then you go, the writer writes himself in, the writer writes himself in, hi, ho, the Dario, the writer. And then I turn to the camera and go, hi, Mom, the writer writes himself in. That was a sketch. And it did really well at the table, and they didn't put it in. They said, no, we don't do breaking the fourth wall anymore. One sketch, and I had told you guys when we were talking about what to talk about, I had one very interesting experience in season 10. Again, for the Ringo show, you try to come up with, well, it's Ringo's star. What can I write that has a British accent in it? Because I know that Ringo doesn't have a lot of range. So I had seen, I was a big fan of the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys have ever seen that movie.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great World War II movie where these British officers who had been who were POWs were forced by a Japanese concentration camp commandant to build a bridge over the River Kwai. That's the movie, and it's a great, great flick.
Excellent.
And I wrote a parody of that, or a sketch where instead of him punishing them by sending them into internment or into isolation, that the Japanese commander was trying to use reverse psychology on them by pretending he was glad that they weren't going to build the bridge for him. So it had lines like, good, I'm glad, bring out the ice cream and the candy canes, stuff like that. So I cast Billy Crystal as the commandant. I didn't know until after I had showed it to him that he'd never seen Bridge Over the River Kwai.
Oh my God.
And this is 1985, maybe even the winter of 84. And back then, you couldn't just go on to a laptop and find the movie.
Oh, right,
so we sent a PA out to try to hunt down the video of, the Betamax of Bridge Over the River Kwai. But in the meantime, I had to go into Billy Crystal's office and do the character for him because it was a very specific guttural Japanese character. And so I had to go into Billy's office and go, well, I know you're really good at voices, but it's kind of like this. He's talking like this. Yes, I'm glad that you did this. So I had to act it out for him. And
Billy's taking
I'm
notes.
doing this thinking, I am giving Billy Crystal acting notes. I am I am coaching him on how to do a character. How surreal is this? And Billy was great. And he took and we eventually, by Friday, I think they had found the videotape and he got to see it. And the sketch didn't play great. It had a couple of missed cues, but yeah, that was cool. And I had, Ringo Starr was in one of my sketches. How often do you get to say that?
There you go.
Yeah.
Jesse Jackson did one of my pieces. Jerry Lewis, who, by the way, Jerry Lewis had this horrible reputation and people think that he was a jerk. And again, I judge people only by my time around them. I don't know what Jerry Lewis is like before or after I met him. He was so nice that week when he came in. He couldn't have been sweeter. He couldn't have been more of a gentleman. In fact, during the read-through on Wednesday, I was seated at the, we were sat in concentric circles and I was seated like behind somebody. And Jerry got up after reading one of the sketches and he's walking around the room pontificating about comedy, in a very nice way. You know what would be funny? And he stops behind me and starts massaging my shoulders. And I'm sitting there thinking, Jerry Lewis is fucking giving me a massage. And it was surreal. And he just did it for a couple of minutes. Maybe I looked tense. I don't know. And then he moved on. But that's another thing that I could say. I got a massage from Jerry Lewis.
Amazing.
So many amazing things happened in those years. Getting to sit down with Michael Palin and working on a sketch. It didn't get in the show, but it was great. And then I tried to reuse that same sketch with Tom Smothers, who was great to work with. Tom Smothers, I don't know whether you know this, he has dyslexia. And it's very hard for him to read. So he really had to struggle to read every sketch.
Oh.
But we reworked the sketch and put it in the packet. It didn't get in again. But I got to meet so many of my heroes. Flip Wilson was a big hero of mine. And I got to meet him and write a sketch for him. But Gary Kroger had made reference to the sketch that I wrote. It was a John Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe sketch where the premise was
yes,
everybody thinks that they're screwing, and really she had a brilliant political mind, and behind closed doors she was telling John Kennedy what to do.
Right.
And I wrote the sketch. I had a big fascination with the Kennedys, and someone had told me that Mary Gross did a really great Marilyn Monroe. And so I wrote the sketch thinking that Mary Gross would play Marilyn, and it went to the table that way. But when we got to the room at 5:00 to see what was in the show, the sketch was in, but we were told that Terry Garr, who was the host, wanted to play Marilyn. Mm-hmm. And I think I even said to Andrew Smith, who was the head writer then, I said, does she do a Marilyn Monroe impression? And he said, well, she says she does. So, Terry Garr, wonderful actress, terrific comedian, but she hadn't done Marilyn before. So I always felt that the sketch probably would have worked better if Mary had played Marilyn, but it got its laughs. And Joe and Gary had come up with this thing with the aya, 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 where they were saying it at the same time.
Yeah,
which
that's great.
I wish I could say I wrote it. I might have put the words aya in the sketch, but they vamped this thing on the stage, and it was great. Yeah. So, yeah, that's my life.
Well, I mean, Kevin, your career didn't end after Saturday Night Live. You've had a very successful career after SNL, right? I mean, you worked on Night Court, A Different World, Boy Meets World, a lot of shows, and you've written several books.
Transition to half hours. Yeah. Once I had worked on virtually every sketch comedy show that existed, I realized that I had run out of the market. So I had to transition to half hours. And then I started getting jobs on shows, and Night Court being one of them, and A Different World, and Boy Meets World, which also has its following to this day. It's amazing that people love that show. And I did their podcast and talked about that experience.
Oh, cool. Nice.
So I was fortunate to have a very long television writing career. Yeah, I mean, I feel blessed to have lived the life that I've lived. And I'm still writing. I'm writing novels now and doing some other stuff in retirement. So, yeah, I'm keeping busy.
One thing I didn't know about till you wrote me and told me, you had a screenplay you wrote for National Lampoon that never got through?
Oh, yeah.
Never got produced?
Yeah, in 1990, my agent told me that Maddie Simmons was looking for somebody to rewrite a script. So Maddie had developed a National Lampoon vacation film called College Bound, National Lampoon's College Bound.
Okay.
And it was the Chevy Chase character taking Rusty to check out colleges, their bonding trip. They had a very funny script that was written by Andrew Breckman, coincidentally. But Chevy decided he didn't want to do it. And Warner Brothers still liked the premise, and Maddie still liked the premise. So they hired me to de-Chevy it, to de-Griswold it.
Right.
And so I ended up writing almost a whole new script. I kept a couple of scenes from the Breckman script that I really liked, and there were some very funny scenes that he wrote. But I developed a script with Maddie, with Warner Brothers, and didn't get made. But yeah, I got to do that. And I also wrote later on when National Lampoon went online, I wrote several articles for them that ran in their online version of the Lampoon that I'm still pretty proud of.
Oh, nice.
That you can't find them anymore because when the company got sold, they did something to the servers. They emptied the servers. So those articles are no longer online. But I wrote a piece called Baby Lipo, which was about a couple that decided to get liposuction for their 6-month or 8-month-old, daughter. And that it was a growing phenomenon in LA of getting liposuction for children. I wrote this piece that I'm really proud of. It was very well received, and a few other pieces like that. Cool. So yeah,
that's awesome.
I'd say the only thing, Kevin, I know you were only there for a short time, 2 years, but anything that you took with you from SNL that just carried over into all the projects we just talked about that you learned from SNL that you've took with you through all your other writing endeavors?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, you learned to produce on SNL. As I mentioned, you were the mini producer of your own sketches. And so those skills obviously served me well in the years to come. But the other thing is, why am I here? Well, sure, I worked on a lot of shows and they all had their moments of glory. But if you ever work on SNL, that's your legacy. To this day, I meet someone, what do you do? Well, I was a television writer. Oh, really? Anything I might have seen? Well, I worked on a few shows. What shows? You're always going to lead with SNL because everybody's heard of it,
Yeah.
And all of my friends, they know, oh, you worked on SNL. So that stays with you for the rest of your life. If you were a movie actor and you weren't a star, but you were in The Godfather, you're always going to mention The Godfather for the rest of your life, And so this was the thing that everybody will remember me for, to the extent that I am remembered. And I'm proud of it. I wish that I'd had a few more seasons there, but I'm proud of the work we did. And apparently people still like it, people like yourselves. And I'm very grateful for that.
Well, we're grateful for you for taking the time. Well, letting us fill your time and talking to us about it.
I'm now done until 2026 or 2027.
Kevin, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. Where can folks find you now?
You can find me at the coffee shop downtown. My books are on Amazon. I wrote a couple of novels. 2 of them were under the name Kevin Kelton. 1 I put under the pseudonym KB Kelton. That's going to fool a lot of people. And I also wrote a book about television writing. And if people, I teach television writing for the UCLA Extension program. And I decided to take all of my lessons and cull them into a book. And it's so far, it actually sells better than my novels do. But if anybody's out there and they've ever thought, I'd like to try my hand at writing, maybe you have a favorite show, whether it's The Bear or whether it was Seinfeld or whatever is out there now that people are watching, and you think, maybe I could do that. This book will walk you through it step by step. Mm-hmm. It's called the Sitcom Writer's Cookbook. Right. I decided to use the cookbook metaphor as a mock cookbook. And I have recipes along the way to teach people how to write their beat sheet and their outline and their first draft and their second draft. You can look for that. But where will they find me? They'll find me in a lot of doctors' offices. I have a lot of doctor's appointments, guys. So it's great. The 50th season, obviously, there's a resurgence of interest in the show because of that. And I'm enjoying it, and I'm glad people are still enjoying it. And it's one of those bright spots in an otherwise questionable world where we can all kind of find a little joy these days.
Yes, very
Good
true.
point.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please take a moment to rate and review the project wherever you find us. You can also drop us a line to let us know what you liked or didn't and what else you might like to hear in the future at nr4ptproject@gmail.com. And lastly, you can find us on social media everywhere at nr4ptproject. Thanks again for listening. Have a pleasant tomorrow.